Welcome to the 2025 K-State Garden Hour webinar series. We're so glad that you're here. This webinar series started in 2020 and has been a collaboration of the entire K-State Horticulture Extension team. Since the start of this program, we have reached over 107,185 gardeners just like you. We're pleased to continue offering the K-State Garden Hour series for free. If you have enjoyed these educational webinars, please consider making a tax-deductible donation to support this program. The link to donate can be found in the chat or on our K-State Garden Hour website. This webinar is hosted by Kansas State Extension. My name is Lane Weens, and I'm the Horticulture Extension Agent for Shawnee County. Everyone involved in the development of this series is an extension professional for K-State. Most of us have a background in horticultural education or a related discipline. Most of all, we each have a love for educating and sharing important gardening topics. Before we get started, we do have a couple housekeeping notes to cover. Please use the Q&A feature for questions related to this presentation. This is where we will be looking for questions at the end of the webinar during the Q&A session. You should be able to see a button along the bottom tab that says Q&A. Just click on that and you'll be able to enter your question. Today's webinar will be recorded and we'll post it to our K-State Garden Hour website. We typically upload additional resources related to each topic as well. If we share the links through chat, we'll also link them on the website. Our website is also where you can have access to previous topics and upcoming topics in the series. Our moderators today are Abby Drott and Cassie Thiessen, and they'll be sharing information through the chat during the presentation. They'll also help us facilitate the Q&A portion of the webinar. Today's topic is Keys to Successful Community Garden Spaces. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker today, Laura Phillips. Please give us a few moments while we transition and share the presentation slides.
All right. So thank you all for joining us today. My name is Laura Phillips, and I'm going to talk to you about keys to successful community garden spaces. Let's see if it advances. There we go. So my background, I'm a horticulture extension agent in the Meadowlark District that covers Jefferson, Jackson, and Nemaha counties. In terms of community gardens, I managed the KU campus garden from 2017 to 2021, and I managed the Douglas County Health Garden in 2020. And now I manage gardens with my Master Gardener program. I'm also always willing to participate in any garden workday that I'm invited to. So before we get too far into everything, I want to address what the term community garden means because it can be a little bit ambiguous. Community can be proximity, so it's a garden in a neighborhood and all of those neighbors participate, or it could be based on a shared identity, like Extension Master Gardener, where all the Extension Master Gardeners work on that garden, even if they live in different areas. It can also refer to allotment plots where everyone gets their own little section of the garden to grow whatever they want. Or it can be a shared garden where everyone works on the same stuff. It could be flower garden, orchard, more, other options. And there's a ton of different ways that they're managed or owned or supported. Um, so when we talk about community gardens, we're going to talk about, some best practices, some common challenges, but remember that every community garden is so incredibly unique that things might be different on a case-by-case basis. Very broadly, the American Community Garden Association defines community gardens as any piece of land gardened by a group of people, which is a really broad definition. So for the sake of this presentation, I'm going to refer to either allotment or shared growing spaces, primarily for food production. So next, we're going to go over a little bit of history and evolution of the gardens. I'm not going to have time to go into all the details, so throughout this, I'll put links in the chat, and that way, if you want to learn more about community gardens at that point in history, you're welcome to do so. So we're going to go back to the UK in the 1500s. That's kind of when we first saw allotment gardens start to pop up, and they would be open field or common land, and everyone would get kind of a strip. This land was usually owned by the village or a local manor, and slowly there was moves to enclose these spaces and privatize land, and this led to kind of some counterculture movements, one of which, the Diggers movement, I find fascinating. And they were in the mid 1600s and they advocated for everyone's right to dig. So they believed that every person should be allowed to access land to grow food on. And there was a lot of back and forth over the centuries, and it ended kind of with the Small Holdings and Allotment Act of 1907. And that is a law still in place today where anywhere in the UK, if 6 or more people want a community garden, the local government is to provide land, unless you're in London where there's just literally no space. And one trend that we do see when we study community gardens on kind of a global scale is that countries where there are rules or regulations like this tend to have more community gardens because there is that government support. So moving over to the US, the first time we start to see public gardens, not necessarily community gardens, is in the 1800s. It's amidst the Industrial Revolution. People in the cities are desperate to be able to see trees and grass and plants and not be surrounded by smog. So we get the first botanical garden in Washington, D.C. Central Park is commissioned. Harvard University establishes the first arboretum. And we actually get our first gardening club, the Ladies Garden Club in Athens, Georgia. And this gardening club is still around today, although it's now just called the Georgia Gardening Club, and you can join no matter your gender. But it is kind of cool that the oldest gardening club is still around. So the first time we see community gardens, not just public gardens, is actually in 1890s Detroit. After the 1893 economic crash, the mayor at the time, Hazen Pingree, saw a lot of unemployed people who were struggling to feed themselves and their families. So he established this agricultural committee for Detroit, and they got 430 acres of land and started putting people who were unemployed to work producing their own food. These became known as Pingree's potato patches, and they were incredibly successful. Within a couple years, over 1,500 families were participating in this program, and delegates from other counties, cities, and states would come and visit and see to try and replicate this back home. And so this is often credited as one of the first true community gardens in the US. Around this time, we also get the start of school gardens. So the first record we have of a school garden is in 1902, which is during the Progressive Era. Progressive Era was, 1890 to 1920. And that was when there was a lot of societal reform and change happening. And one woman decided that she was going to start a school garden. Her name was Frances Grissom Parsons, and she started this school garden in New York City. And people loved the idea. Within a few years, over 75,000 gardens were established either for schools or for the purpose of children, whether it was attached to an after-school program or like a Sunday school program. And so there's a picture of some teachers with Henry Parsons, the person who established the first community garden in New York City. The first time we see a big surge kind of nationwide in community gardens is during World War I, when President Woodrow Wilson promoted growing your own food as a patriotic duty because the war was going on and they were worried about food scarcity. And they established the War Garden Committee to help promote community gardens. And a lot of seed companies really leaned into this. There's an ad here from Burpee, which a lot of us still use Burpee seeds today, where they equate, buying their seeds to winning the war. And you would get lots of seed packets where people had, red, white, and blue. It was all very, very patriotic. And so because school gardens were kind of coming up at that same time, we actually saw the creation of the United States School Garden Army in 1918. And within a year or two, there was over 2.5 million children enrolled in this program. Some estimates say up to 6 million. And there was lots of imagery of, Uncle Sam leading children to gardening. And the second big flush of gardens is in World War II. This time they rebrand them to be Victory Gardens instead of War Gardens, because that sounds a lot nicer. And Eleanor Roosevelt actually planted the first vegetable garden at the White House. She's not in this picture. This is some visitors tending to her garden. And within a few years of Victory Gardens kind of coming up again, they produced 40% of an American's, diet, which is an astonishing amount. And there was, again, lots of imagery, planting gardens for victory, and a lot of the U.S. would, the federal government would make these pamphlets, these handouts that would instruct people on how to grow victory gardens. So they provided a lot of educational materials and instruction manuals at that time, too. The next time we see a surge outside of the wars is in the 60s and 70s, and that's because there was this counterculture movement that one of their values was food as a human right. And so there's a lot of co-ops, communes being established to grow food, and this kind of coincided with a lot of very powerful environmental literature of the time, like Rachel Carlson's Silent Spring, Wendell Berry's essays on local food systems, and that kind of furthered this idea of get back to growing food in your community. And since then, we continue to see waves of community gardens. The number of community gardens has been growing since the 70s. We saw another vegetable garden installed the first time since Eleanor Roosevelt, when Michelle Obama installed one at the White House with the local elementary school. We saw a 44% increase in community gardens in the 2010s amongst the biggest cities in the US. And most recently, the pandemic revived a lot of interest in gardening for people across the US. So why do I talk about all of this? So I think there's a few things that we want to learn from the history and the evolution of community gardens. One is that they can play a huge role in our society. In all of these instances, they were really responding to political or social economic movements of the time. They're not just a stagnant thing, but they evolve as our society evolves. So they're really kind of a part of our culture and our community. And also that government or institutional support at any level can play a pretty big role in gardening success. So why community gardens? There's a lot of reasons why. We could have a whole presentation on just why community gardens. Some of the reasons: it serves as this non-commercial third space. It's a place to gather, even if you don't have extra spending money outside of the home and outside of school or work. It provides social capital, meaning that it helps increase your network of people. It has all kinds of positive behavioral impacts, from eating better, increased physical activity, mobility improvements. And it has positive environmental impacts between providing space for pollinators, for birds, for other wildlife. These can be really important pieces of conservation in a time of environmental habitat loss. It also helps your mental health. I know a lot of people who they're so excited to get home and go to their garden because that is a place that's very grounding for them. It's very soothing. They get to release the stress of the day and get back in touch with nature. And many community gardens are also a place where you make friends and you bond and you feel closer to your community. So what are some of the challenges? That's kind of the key part of this presentation, is what are the challenges and how do we overcome them? So one study in 2013 to 2015, it looked at community gardens across Canada and the US. It didn't look at every community garden. It looked at about 9,000 community gardens. And over the 5 years of their study, they found that about 1,500 of those 9,000 closed. So their next question was why? And their surveys resulted in 37% closed from a lack of motivation and participation, 30% closed from a lack of land, 15% closed from a lack of funding and resources, and then the other percent were a lot of different variables. But this is a really common trend. A lot of studies that look at challenges or barriers or reasons why community gardens close, these three reasons are some of the most consistently listed reasons that community gardens do not make it. So from that, I'm going to talk about 4 components to successful community gardens. First is motivated participants and community interest. Second is good communication. And when I say this, I mean communication with the people who are gardening, with the public, and with your partners or sponsors or support networks. Land, and specifically land that will not get taken away and that has access to water. And then funding and resources. You know, you need tools, you need seeds, you need maintenance, who's going to pay for the water, all those kinds of things. So first, motivation. What motivates a gardener? For many people, it's a childhood connection to gardening. That's what it is for me, because as you can see, I loved gardening as a child. It's also to be closer to nature. This is especially true and most commonly in cities. This is one of the most common reasons, because there's not always a lot of other ways to get into green spaces. People also want to be able to produce their own food and save money, know where their food comes from, know that it's, you know, nutritionally sound. There's the mental and physical benefits that we talked about. Creating this shared green space, again, especially important when there's not a lot of other green spaces in the area. And also, people are really motivated to learn together as a group. It can be a lot less fun if you're trying to learn something on your own. But when you have other people there to bounce ideas off of, to learn from, to teach, it can just feel a lot easier to learn a new skill. And then also drive societal change. That's something that we've seen throughout history, whether it was to fill in food production gaps or whether it was more of a counterculture movement in the 70s. Some people are motivated by their values, their societal change values. So looking at some of the connections between motivation and participation, to no one's surprise, the rates of participation are high when people are motivated. So what creates some of that motivation? And some studies have shown that the more emotionally attached you are to your garden, the likelier you are to be motivated and to participate. And that makes sense because you're not going to spend a lot of time doing something that you don't care about. This research has also showed that having any prior garden training of any kind, it doesn't have to be formal, or having garden experiences means you are more likely to develop that emotional tie. So this teaches us that providing workshops, trainings, or technical resources to new gardeners can be a key component of getting them to stay motivated and participated. And not every community garden has the ability to host their own trainings. So I'm not saying, you have to have garden workshops at your garden, but it can be something as simple as having resources for people, informing them when the Master Gardener trainings are happening, sending them to K-State Garden Hour, providing resources for them so that they do have a little bit of that training, are more likely to develop that connection. Next, the gardens must be based on community interest. Very broadly speaking, we can divide the way that community gardens are developed into two categories. The first being top-down, where some organization or institution or group comes in, they build a garden and they hand it off to the community. The other is bottom-up, where there's a bunch of community members, they get together, they say, we're going to make ourselves a community garden. Statistically speaking, top-down gardens are more likely to be vandalized or abandoned, and that's because the community members don't always feel an attachment to that garden because they didn't have a say in it. Whereas the bottom-up gardens, which are created by the community members themselves, usually are more in line with the visions that those members have for their garden. And now there are times when you can have top-down with bottom-up support, and organizations come in and build a garden and they work really hard to bring in community members to do a needs assessment and to make sure that the community garden is in line with the community interest. So I'm not saying all top-down gardens are going to fail. But if you have a top-down garden and you're in that planning phase, it is important to get that bottom-up support. So there's a really interesting case study that looks at 3 gardens. It looks at the motives and then the structures. And we see that there is a correlation between the motivations and the structure. And that's really interesting because it helps us understand if we're starting a community garden, maybe we should understand the motives of our community, and that can inform how we structure it. So for example, the first garden that this study looked at, people wanted to be closer to nature. They wanted to improve their individual health. Most of them had a childhood connection to gardening. A lot of them had pretty busy lives and not a ton of time to spare. So the way they styled their garden was an allotment garden. Each person got to have their own plot, and they had a pretty strong hierarchical system. There was one elected person that made most of the decisions and outsourced a lot of the communal space landscaping because people wanted these benefits, but they didn't have the time to constantly be doing all this extra work. The second garden, people were more focused on community and community learning. They're more focused on interpersonal relationships. And there was less focus on the individual health and the individual benefits. And so they had a communal garden that was governed by monthly assemblies. They had some formal structures in their decision making, but a lot of it was also coming together as a group and deciding. The third garden was they wanted to have this public green space available to everyone, no matter what. They wanted to push the envelope with new, different permaculture techniques, really learn together and drive societal change in their community. And their structure was almost the complete opposite of garden number 1. They had a very communal garden. There's no hierarchy, and they had weekly meetings where every decision was made and people showed up every single week. And so that's not to say any one of these structures or motivations is better than the other. It's just to show how it is important to consider the motivations as you structure your garden, and structure your garden in a way that's going to meet the needs and the wants and the desires of your community members. So some best practices. One, as I said, provide and recommend training and resources. A really great one is the Kansas Garden Guide, and that's a fantastic resource for people of all levels, whether you are brand new to gardening or you're an expert. It's just a fantastic resource. Next, don't overwhelm your gardeners. So if you have a lot of obligations, every gardener needs to maintain, so many volunteer hours, and they need to help with fundraising, and they need to do XYZ, that can lower participation because people feel overwhelmed. You need to let them form some emotional attachment, and then they're more willing to work harder for that garden because they care and they see the positive benefit. And building your community garden around the interests and the needs of the group. So there shouldn't be one person that makes a garden as a passion project and then tries to get everyone else to join in afterwards. It should be several community members coming together to collaborate on this shared vision. So that's kind of the bottom up structure I was talking about, or a mixed one where it's top down with bottom up support. So the next challenge we see is communication. A lot of gardeners cite poor communication as the reason that they left or that they saw other people left. And there's a lot of ways that communication can break down. It can be disagreements amongst gardeners or between the garden and the landowner. It can be that decisions are being made by some people without others knowing or giving feedback. The communication might be inconsistent. If you have like 4 different ways that you communicate, you use Teams and email and text and Facebook, that's going to be really difficult for people to check all of those mediums. And if there's too much, if you're pinging people every single day and they're constantly getting notifications, they might be discouraged and not want that level of notifications and involvement. And again, then too little. So it's kind of that you need that Goldilocks of communication. So some best practices. First, communicate expectations. And this needs to start in the planning phase. So when you first start creating a mission statement that is based on either a needs assessment or the community input, because you want to make sure that everyone is on board with how this garden is going to go and you understand everyone's motivations. It's a great time to also include whoever owns the land, because if you don't have a good relationship with them, they don't agree with how you're planting your garden, it might be the end of your garden in that spot at least. This is also a great time to decide what rules, guidelines, bylaws you want for your garden. Because if people do not know how the garden is formed, or how they're expected to behave in the garden, it can be difficult to keep everything in check. And when you're starting a garden, you might think like, oh, that's a lot to write bylaws. But there are a lot of resources. We'll link some in the chat. There's a toolkit by Missouri State and by North Carolina State that both have some sample bylaws or rules that you can use and you can modify, adopt to fit your community garden needs. Along with this, one of those, the North Carolina resource also has like an FAQ page for what they see are the most frequently asked questions by new gardeners entering a community garden. So they have a page where you can print it off. It asks a whole bunch of questions and you can answer for what's true about your garden. And then when new people come in, you can give them this FAQ page and answer a lot of their questions up front, make sure everything is clear. Next, you need to determine how decisions are going to be made and by who. And again, this depends on the audience. Some community gardens may really thrive with a hierarchical system where others want everyone to vote on everything. But if you have a hierarchical structure, the biggest thing is to allow for group input and make sure people know that their input is valued. So be transparent about your decisions, and make sure that you're not just unanimously deciding directions of what's going to happen in your garden. So next, establishing your communication methods. So are you going to use texting? Are you going to use email? Are you going to use Teams? Are you going to use Facebook groups? Determine ideally 1 or 2, not more than that, methods you're going to use to communicate with your gardeners, with the participants in this community garden, and set a regular schedule for essential information, whether that's every week, every other week, every month. It depends on your garden and your gardeners. You also want to make sure that you have a way to communicate with your partners or your sponsors. Most of the time, if people are partnering or sponsoring you, it's because they care about the work. They want to hear what's happening, and you want to have a good relationship with them so that they continue to partner with you or sponsor you. So it's important to give them updates and have that established communication. Next, make sure you're communicating with the public, and this kind of has 2 components to it. One is if you're having public work days, if you're doing fundraising, if you're doing garden training, if you're trying to recruit, you need to have some established form of communication, whether it's flyers up at the local library or social media. You need to be able to get the word out to the community. The next is letting visitors know the expectations. There are some gardens that I've worked in where anyone who visits can take the produce home with them. And if somebody who is used to that style of garden comes to a garden where everyone has their own individual plot, if there's not a sign, they might not know that this isn't free produce. They might think, oh, it's next to the health center, it's free produce. So if you don't want people picking your veggies, entering the garden, pulling weeds, whatever, you need to have signs so that people who happen upon your garden know. So the next challenge is land, and this is a really big one. Community gardens usually don't own their own land. Some do, but they generally lease it, borrow it, or sometimes even squat on their land. There are a lot of times neighbors have a vacant lot. They go and they just start gardening on it, regardless of what people say. Um, so you will find community gardens in these vacant lots, in parks, in land that's owned by schools or churches or health departments or community centers. All different types of public organizations might have community gardens. And this is great, but it's also important to keep in mind that your land might get sold for development, or the landowner might decide to kick you off that land, or they might decide they're going to demolish their community center and build a whole new one, and now there's no more space for a community garden. So you have to kind of be prepared for that and think about that in advance. You know, one of the largest community gardens back in the early 2000s was the South Central Farm in LA. It was about 14 acres. And it was just shut down because the city decided they needed to sell that land for development for new buildings, and the whole community garden was closed. So how do we combat some of these challenges? First is just really be selective about the land that you choose. Just because you can find land doesn't mean it's good for the community garden. You have to make sure that you have permission to use it and are likely going to have permission for many, many years. Know the zoning laws. Sometimes zoning laws might prohibit the development or a community garden in that space. You might want to check, does the landowner have insurance for community gardens? Are they willing to get insurance to cover that? And where is the water? Because if you don't have water that's easy to access, it can be detrimental to the survival of your community garden. The first garden I worked in, when I got there, our only water source was way up on a hill. And so every time we watered, we had to unroll 400 feet of hose and then roll it back up when we were done. And people did not want to do that. So participation was pretty low. And we finally got a grant, got our own water system, and it was like night and day. People were like, oh, yeah, I'll come water. Totally, because they didn't have to hike up a hill with this heavy hose. Um, Something else to think about with water is, depending on where the water is from, you may want to get it tested for E. coli or other microbes. And I'll throw a link in the chat. K-State does have a program where we will test both nutrients, and you can also get that microbial testing done. We also have a decision tree that helps you determine if you need that testing or not. So, you know, if you're going to get water from a pond that used to be a cattle pond and you're going to siphon it out, I might get that testing done. If it's city water, there's less likely to be chance of contamination in it. So next, with choosing your land, you also want a place with good growing conditions across all the seasons, right? So is it going to get 6 hours of sun, spring, summer, and fall? What kind of soil does it have? You can use K-State as a resource for that. We've got a soil testing lab. And what is the drainage like? If we have a rainy season, is it going to flood? You know, and in this picture here, that space might normally make a great community garden, but when it really pours, it's completely flooded. So you wouldn't want to put a community garden there. Knowing what the wind is going to be like. Is it going to be really exposed to the elements? Is everything going to blow over? And you might feel a little like lost on all of these different site factors when it comes to, you know, choosing a good growing spot. But if you look at the K-State Garden Guide, the Kansas Garden Guide, we do have a chapter on site selection, and that's a really great resource to use to make sure that you think of all of the different aspects. The next part of choosing your land is the surrounding areas, because you need to make sure that people can get to your garden. So if you have a sidewalk that goes by your garden, that's a really great thing. But if you're next to heavy traffic, that might deter people from going to your garden. Or if there's no public transit. For example, the KU Student Farm, it's an allotment style community garden. It's way out by the airport. So they have tons of space, great for growing, but if a student doesn't have a car, it's pretty inaccessible. And then additionally is their parking. Um, so in this example here, we can see there's a road, doesn't look like there's a sidewalk, doesn't look like there's much in the way of parking at this garden space. Um, so it would be potentially a really great garden spot if it were for all of these houses over here and everyone was able to park in their own driveway and walk over. But if this were a community garden for, master gardeners or for another group, this would be really difficult because there's no good parking. Another thing to think about that sometimes people don't consider until the time comes is, could you get a truck into that space? If you need to have somebody dump a truckload of mulch, if you want to build a pavilion, you need to get lumber in there. If you want to put in a sidewalk, you need to get cement in there. Are you going to be able to get a truck into your garden space? And then next, does the garden have space to grow? If people are loving this garden and it's doing great, can you expand? And sometimes you're in a city and that's not an option, but if you have two options and one is bigger, even if you start a smaller garden, you might want to expand in the future. So one of the next challenges is funding and resources. Gardens don't just require funds to establish, they also require continued support. Somebody's going to have to pay that water bill year to year if you're using city water. Gardens often complain that it's easier to get the initial funding. Everyone wants to help establish a community garden, but then no one wants to support you to pay your water bill. So it can be harder to have funding after that initial establishment. And top-down gardens statistically are some of the biggest victims of this because there's just not often a plan for continued support once that organization or institution hands it off to the community. And then these things can just be exacerbated if you're living somewhere that's, high living cost, high cost of water. So some best practices: plan out a yearly budget. And in one of the resources that we linked earlier, the North Carolina toolkit, there is a template for planning out your budget. So I recommend doing that, before you even get your garden started. Plan out what you're going to need initially, and then plan out what you expect your needs are going to be year to year after the initial establishment. Figure out your water source. Again, I keep talking about water, but it's such a big one, and who's going to pay for it, how you're going to fund it. And then there's a lot of other questions. Does the garden provide tools? Do they provide storage for the tools? Are the tools going to be kept there year round? If you need to provide tools, how are you going to secure them to make sure they're not stolen? So here is an example of a very cheap tool storage that I built for a community garden when I was in college. We got all the lumber donated from Home Depot, and the tin roof, I actually pulled that off an old barn and cut it down to the right size and put it on. So it basically cost us nothing to build that. So there are ways to make, a shed or some sort of storage that are not as much money as building a whole new, nice, big, beautiful shed. Another good practice for your funding and your resource needs is partnering with other groups. In 2013, there was a study that showed out of 445 community garden organizations across US and Canada, only 1% of those organizations functioned without any partnerships. And this doesn't mean that you have to have, your local city behind you. It doesn't mean you have to have your local health department behind you. It doesn't, it's not saying that we can only be successful in community gardens when the federal government mandates it. It's just saying that the more network you have, the more different people you can collaborate with, the more support you're going to get, the more likely your community garden is to thrive. So a lot of partnerships are through the local parks department, schools, health departments, community centers, sometimes libraries. There's a lot of people that are usually pretty down with having a community garden in their space. Next is networking with non-gardeners, and this might not be something you initially think about. So there is a study done on community gardens across Europe, and participants were asked to rank what skills do you look for in people that you want to join the garden. And the technical garden skills actually were pretty low on that list. The most in-demand skill was resource gathering and was communication. So gardens will need participants that not only can, but also want to help source funds or materials, that will be willing to lobby for support, that are willing to network and find partnerships and find external support. And you might also find people who have no interest in community gardens, but they really believe in the mission and they're willing to support your initiative in other ways, like helping fix the fence, or maybe you have somebody who knows plumbing and can fix if a pipe bursts. So having, diversifying the skill set of your community garden. So um, I'll throw a link in the chat to a guide by the National Parks and Rec Department on their recommended community garden practices. And they have a lot of information on how to form partnerships and networks and ways to go about it. Some of the things that they say, and that a lot of other toolkits will tell you, is start looking for your partnerships really early on. Don't wait until your garden's already established. Try and get that initial support. And when you approach different people, make sure you bring with you a solid idea on your mission statement for your community garden, so that you can say, hey, this is what we're about, this is our goals, this is what we want to do. Are you interested? And it can be helpful if you have some sort of shared value with that partner. Maybe you're approaching the health department and you say, like, hey, we really want to put a community garden here. We really want to focus on improving diet and dietary habits. And that's something that the community health department might already be working on, and they're willing to partner with you. Options, ideas are schools, parks department, local farmers or growers, farmers markets, gardening groups, master gardeners, your neighbors, community leaders. There's all kinds of different people you can find a partner with. Another practice is to keep generating revenue, and this can be difficult. One option is yearly or every other year fundraisers. People often do maybe plant sales, or they do seed sales, or they might offer tours of the garden for a fee, bake sales, all different kinds of ways that you can generate revenue. And these can be great sources of income, but it's really important to assess your group's capacity before you do that. Because as we mentioned earlier with participation and motivation, if your gardeners don't feel like they can fulfill their obligations, they're less likely to stay in your group. And so if you've got a very small group where, in order to do some kind of fundraiser, it would require a lot of work from each individual person, that's less likely to be successful. If you've got a really large group where everyone is able to carry a little piece of that workload, that's much more likely to thrive, because it's not overwhelming any individual one person. And then depending on the garden's target audience, you may consider membership fees. There are certain times where a membership fee might not be appropriate. For example, school gardens. We wouldn't really want to charge children fees to work in the garden. If it's a garden where it's meant to provide produce to anyone who walks in, then maybe you wouldn't want to charge a membership fee, because you're opening it up to anyone and you might not have an official roster. But there are times where, if you have a more structured garden and it's not attached to a school, a membership fee can help you cover your water costs. It can help cover any communal landscaping needs, and can support your garden, make sure it lasts as long as possible. So if we're kind of looking at all of this and summarizing it, we come back to these 4 challenges and the best practices that go with them. The first thing, motivate. You want to build your community gardens around your community's interest, whether this is through a needs survey or getting community input. That bottom-up approach can be really, really essential. Next, communicating, establishing your communication methods and your expectations and your rules. So you want to make sure that you have a way to communicate in your group, with the public, with your supporters, your sponsors, your partners, so that everybody everything is really transparent. This also includes making sure there's avenues for feedback and transparency within the decision-making process. This also includes making sure you don't have 15 different communication mediums because messages will get lost. People won't know where to look for info. Next, land. You really want to choose a place that is optimal in terms of access, in terms of the plant growing conditions, and in terms of the ability for gardeners to get there. So again, when it comes to those site conditions, you can use that Kansas Garden Guide, and it has a lot of great information on choosing the best place environmentally, climate-wise, for a garden. And then when you're thinking about the public access, think about, is there public transit? Is there a bus stop nearby? Is there parking? Is it next to a heavy trafficked area, or are there sidewalks? Is it more of a pedestrian area? How visible is my garden from the street? People are going to see it and be interested. And then your resources and your funding. So that's again where you want to plan in advance. Use that budget worksheet from North Carolina and make sure you plan out your initial year and also your subsequent years so that you're not in for a surprise when you realize, oh man, it's going to cost this much money to sustain my garden year to year. You know, okay, this is what to expect. This is where we're going to get the funding. This is how we're going to make it work. And start networking early. It's easier to bring people in sometimes during that initial planning phase because there's usually a lot more excitement and motivation about ideas, and it can be harder once you've already established to be able to bring in some of those partners and those networks. And this, again, gardeners and non-gardeners alike, because you're going to have people who have different skill sets besides just gardening, people who can fix your fences, people who can lay a sidewalk, people who can write grants, people who can organize a fundraiser. None of us have all of those skills. So making sure that you partner with gardeners and non-gardeners. And another great resource that will be in the chat is the K-State landing page for information about community gardens. This links to a lot of resources. This has information on community gardens that might be in your area. And it's got some videos with instructional information on community gardens that you can use as well. And with that, I am ready to answer any of your questions, whatever they may be.
All right, thank you, Laura. That was an awesome presentation. Okay, so we do have a couple questions and people have already been answering them in the chat, but we'll go ahead and get
Awesome.
your opinion on it as well. Somebody asked, they have gardens established, but they've been kind of neglected. Do you have any ideas to kind of rehabilitate gardens to avoid shutdown?
Yeah, so like a garden that's already kind of on the downward slope.
Yes.
Okay. I think that's where I would come in and try and figure out what were the initial motivations for the garden and what was the loss of motivation. Was the garden perhaps not built in a way that was accessible to people? It could be that the location was difficult to access. It could be that, there are instances where you might have a garden where there's a lot of seniors or retired individuals who are participating if there's not sidewalks or easy ways for them to get to the garden plots. That could be a reason why there is low participation. So trying to figure out what was maybe that catalyst for the decline, and then trying to solve it. And I think this is again where somebody who has networking skills, good communication skills is going to be really essential. You might need to do another needs assessment. Maybe the needs of the community have changed. That's another one is, we've seen throughout history, community gardens are changing constantly because the society, our culture, our society is changing. So maybe the initial need for this garden is no longer there, and you need to figure out what the new need for this garden is. And it can be difficult. I think sometimes it's more difficult to revamp an old garden than a new garden because people have sometimes lost faith in that garden. They think, well, it failed. Why would I put my time into it again? It's going to fail. Whereas when there's never been a community garden before, people think, oh, this is a great idea, and they're motivated and they're excited. So figuring out a way to communicate with people what the change is going to be and have them, fully understand how you're going to keep this garden running and avoid the previous pitfalls.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, this community garden, they donate all their produce to local organizations.
Uh-huh.
So, do you have any best practices or success stories to motivate those volunteers to do the less than exciting tasks like weeding?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that is a really good one to talk about too, because the first garden that I worked in, we would harvest all the produce and donate it. And so we spent a lot of time just out there doing the less fun tasks, the weeding, the mulching. And we didn't necessarily get to see the fruits of our labor because after we put it on the truck, we didn't get to see all the people who were going to enjoy it and use it. And it was very thankless. And I think some people thought like, oh, volunteering, people are going to like love you and appreciate you. And this was like you spent, 4 hours sweating and then you put stuff on a truck and you went home. And I think that definitely made motivation lower. So we tried really hard to do things like weighing the produce and circulating those statistics, giving information on where the produce was going, getting pictures or videos of the produce on display in the campus cupboard, which is where all our produce went. Um, and encouraging participants to take, a little bit home with them so that they do still feel like the fruits of their labor. Um, I think in general, no matter what the garden, getting people to weed can be really difficult because it's just not as fun of a task. So I always tried to do things like incorporate education. Maybe we went out and weed, but we also identified the weeds and we learned something about them. Or maybe we talked about ways to plant things that are kind of like a living mulch that will snuff out weeds and kind of create, some more of a sort of a ground cover. Um, and there's a lot of different ways to try and like make it more fun, make it something where it's people coming in a group rather than individuals having to weed at certain slots, trying to focus on that community learning, because as we know, like one of the top motivating things is community bonding, is learning. So incorporating some of those motivational ideas into the tasks and making sure people get to still see the fruits of their labor, even if they're not like physically there to see it.
Yeah, I love that, making it more fun. You just have to get creative. Okay, this question is about organic gardening.
Uh-huh.
So, do you think easier access to organic produce has impacted an interest in community gardening?
I don't know for sure because I haven't, looked into that research wise, but I would probably say yes. I think there is a big movement. People want to know where their food is coming from. They want to know what's in it. They want to know, was it ethically sourced? Were people paid an appropriate rate wage to grow this produce? Um, and sometimes the produce you can get in the grocery store has such a big question mark around it that a lot of people really do grow their own produce to kind of answer some of those questions for themselves. I think it varies community by community. There are some communities where there is more of a culture of, organic and natural and knowing where things came from than others. But I would say that that's definitely a motivator for people.
Okay. This person wants to know if your garden's holding a plant sale to raise some money, do you have to have a certain license?
That is a great question, and one that I don't know if I'm qualified to answer. And I think that would also depend on the status of your garden. If you were registered as a nonprofit, or if you had some sort of other business license, or if it's going through another organization. So, for example, if you are part of a master gardener group, you might not have to worry about that because it's going through K-State or it's going through your local district or your local county office rather than the garden itself. And they already have policies in place for how to handle income and sales. If it's tied to, a school, or if it's tied to a community center or a health department, again, they probably already have things in place for how they handle fundraising and how they report that on their taxes. It's more of a question when you get to those small independent grassroots gardens that aren't necessarily attached to other organizations that can handle that side of it for you. And that's where I would actually recommend reaching out to your local library, because they have a lot of business resources like that, or the Kansas Small Business Development Center, because they can help with a lot of that, like financial questions, because, depending on if you're in Kansas versus another state, rules and regulations might be different. Kansas, we have the Small Business Development Center. There's likely a similar program in other states that can help you figure those questions out and make sure that you're paying taxes if you need to and going through the right avenues.
Okay, thank you. One that came in earlier and it was answered in the Q&A, but I wanted to get your opinion as well. Um, so if the community garden has some poor soils and they want to do some composting, but there might be like laws or restrictions, do you have any
Yes.
suggestions or any workarounds for that?
Yeah, so there are some restrictions around selling compost. If you're going to sell compost, you have to be able to certify that it has reached a certain temperature and has followed certain processes. And I can find that information and have it posted underneath this video, because there is a guide to that. That would be through the Kansas Department of Agriculture. If you are composting for yourself, you don't necessarily need to follow those regulations, but if you're composting and it's going to go to other people, I would highly recommend that you follow those regulations to make sure that there is not any chance of disease between the compost and uh, the produce. And if you don't have the capacity in your small garden to follow all of those regulations, but you still want to compost, I would say you can still compost, and maybe you use that soil in your walkways, or you use it in the pollinator patch, or you use it, somewhere else that's not going to directly come in contact with produce.
Okay. Do you know, is there like a directory of community gardens, or how would someone find a community garden in their area?
I would start by talking to your local extension office, especially if they have a master gardener program, because they usually know of all of the gardens in the area, or your local library. Those are two really great places to start asking. There are some directories like the People's Garden Network, but the problem is that not all gardens opt into those. And so you might not get to see everything. I think that it's easier to find the gardens when you ask the locals rather than trying to go to the larger directories, just because they often miss the small gardens, especially if you're in, a smaller town. It can be easier to find a garden if you're like in Kansas City or Wichita, where there's a lot more people, but it can be hard. If you go to the link that we posted that takes you to the K-State's community garden kind of information landing page, there is several links to community gardens throughout Kansas. I saw Sharon just posted one in the chat for Douglas County. But you can also look on that page to see some of the ones in Kansas that we have linked to.
Okay, that's all the questions we had. Thank you, Laura. That was a great presentation.
Thank you so much.
We'll hand it off to Lane.
Perfect. We typically have more questions than we have time for, but we'll be sure to link several articles related to this session on our website. We hope these resources will help you answer your questions, but if you need additional information, please contact your local K-State Extension office. Once again, thank you for joining the K-State Garden Hour series hosted by K-State Extension. We're so glad you could be here today to learn about keys to successful community garden spaces. You can visit the K-State Garden Hour website to view our recorded Garden Hour archive or to make a tax-deductible donation to support the continuation of this webinar series. This session was recorded and will be posted on the website by tomorrow afternoon. After this webinar ends today, you'll receive a prompt to take an evaluation survey. Please fill this out. We would greatly appreciate your feedback. If you have any other questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at gardenhour@ksu.edu. Thank you again for being here today. We hope you continue to tune in each month. Have a great week.